Today, Europe and Western culture dominates most of the world and economic markets. But how did the world end up this way? Imperialism is when a stronger country dominates a weaker country, whether by military force or by diplomacy. And it is imperialism that created the world we know today. And it's very important to understand how our world has developed. Even in the Japan Times is still tweeting about imperialism today. Taking this back one more step, while were some countries stronger, while were some weaker, this can be contributed to the industrialization. Industrialization helped fuel the start of imperialism in the 19th century. The age of imperialism started around the late 1800s after the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution was the catalyst to imperialism. The Industrial Revolution created fast economic growth as well as huge improvements in technology. And because of these new improvements, population growth was on the rise. People were living longer. There was a mass production of goods and changes in the distribution of those goods. Why the Industrial Revolution started in Great Britain? The Industrial Revolution started in Great Britain because of their geographic advantages and able farm animals. Soon, industrialization spread throughout Europe and to the United States. These new industrialized nations needed more raw materials to fuel their mass production and population growth. And in order to maximize the country's profits, these industrialized nations went out to find nations that they could exploit natural resources and cheap labor, from thus leading to imperialism. By the late 19th century, one-fourth of the Earth's territory redistributed among less than 12 industrialized countries. All of these countries were scrambling to get the best natural resources to fuel their factories, growing populations, and economic growth caused by industrialization. Looking at the countries that did not industrialize, we see that they were the ones who were taken over by imperialism. And in this chapter, we will tackle about the development of industrialization and nationalism. We will try to find out how the Industrial Revolution saw a shift from an economy based on farming and handicrafts to an economy based on manufacturing by machines and industrial factories, and how the three important ideologies, which are the conservatism, nationalism, and liberalism, emerged to play an important role in world history. Lastly, we will try to find out how Romanticism and Realism reflected changes in society in Europe and in North America. Good day, everyone. I am Nadine P. Villarruel from the Bachelor of Secondary Education major in Social Studies 3D, and this is Chapter 12, Industrialization and Nationalism. As you will learn during the Industrial Revolution, Europe saw a shift from an economy based on farming and handicrafts to an economy based on manufacturing by machines in factories. The Industrial Revolution began in Great Britain in 1780s and took several decades to spread to other Western nations. Here are the several factors that contributed to make Great Britain the starting place. First, their agricultural practices had changed. Expansion of farmland, good weather, improved transportation, and new crops such as potato led to a dramatic increase in the food supply. More people could fed at lower prices with less labor. Second, with more abundant food supplies, the population grew. In the 1700s, Parliament passed laws that allow large landowners to fence off common lands. As a result of this enclosure movement, many peasants were forced to move to towns to work in the new factories. Third, Britain had a ready supply of money or capital to invest in the new industrial machines and the factories needed to house them. Because many British people were very wealthy, some code entrepreneurs were interested in finding new business opportunities and new ways to make profits. Fourth, the natural resources were plentiful in Britain. The country's many rivers provided water power and a means for transporting raw materials and finished products from one place to another. Britain also had abundant supplies of coal and iron ore, which is essential in manufacturing processes. Finally, a supply of markets gave British manufacturers a ready outlet for their goods. Britain had a vast colonial empire and British ships could transport goods anywhere in the world. As you can see, Great Britain is the best example of an industrial nation gone imperialistic. Because of certain environmental factors and political situations, Great Britain was the first country to experience industrialization. In addition, because of population growth and cheaper food at home, domestic markets were increasing. A growing demand for cotton cloth led British manufacturers to begin to look for ways to increase production. That's why in the 18th century, Great Britain had surged ahead in the production of inexpensive cotton goods. The manufacture of cotton cloth was a two-step process. First, the spinner made cotton thread from raw cotton. Then weavers wove the thread into cloths on looms. And these tasks were done by individuals in their rural homes, a production method known as cottage industry. And then a series of technological advantages in the 18th century made cottage industry inefficient. First, the invention of flying shuttle. The flying shuttle was invented by John Kay in 1733. Using the flying shuttle, one weaver could weave fabrics on any width more quickly than two could before. And then in 1764, James Hargreaves had invented a spinning machine called spinning jenny. Other inventors made similar contributions. The spinning process became much faster. In fact, thread was being produced faster than weavers could use it. And then another invention made it possible for the weaving of cloth to catch up with the spinning of thread. This was a water-powered loom invented by Edmund Cartwright in 1787. Edmund Cartwright was an English inventor and is remembered today for inventing the powered loom along with other devices important to the textile industry in England. A loom is a device that is used to weave together threads in order to produce a fabric. It now become more efficient to bring workers to the new machines and have them work in factories near streams and rivers, which were used to power many of the early machines. And then the cotton industry became even more productive when the steam engine was improved in the 1760s by Scottish engineer James Watt. In 1782, James Watt made changes that enabled the engine to drive machinery. Steam engines are a particularly illustrative example of how changes brought by industrialization lead to even more changes in other areas. Steam power could now be used to spin and weave cotton. Because steam engines were fired by coal, they did not need to be located near rivers. British cotton cloth production increased dramatically. Now we move on with the coal and iron industries. The steam engine was crucial to Britain's Industrial Revolution. For fuel, the engine depended on coal, a substance that seemed then to be unlimited in quantity. The success of the steam engine increased the need for coal and led to an expansion in coal production. New processes using coal aided the transformation of another industry, which is the iron industry. Britain's natural resources included large supplies of iron ore. At the beginning of the 18th century, The basic process of producing iron had changed little since the Middle Ages. It became possible to produce a better quality of iron in the 1780s when Henry Court developed a process called puddling. In the process, coke, which was derived from coal, was used to burn away impurities in crude iron, called pig iron, and produce an iron of high quality. In the 18th century, more efficiency of moving resources and goods developed. All-weather roads improved year-round transport, but it was the railroads that were particularly important. In 1804, the first steam-powered locomotive ran on an industrial rail line in Britain. It pulled 10 tons of ore and 70 people at 5 miles per hour. And then better locomotives follow. One called the Rocket was used on the first public railway line, which opened in 1830 and extended 32 miles from Liverpool to Manchester, England. The Rocket sped along at 16 miles per hour while pulling a 40-ton train. Building railroads created new jobs for farmers, laborers, and peasants. Less expensive transportation led to a lower priced goods. And then the factory was another important element in the Industrial Revolution. From its beginning, the factory created a new labor system. Factory owners wanted to use their machines constantly, so workers were forced to work in shifts to keep the machines producing at a steady rate. Early factory workers came from rural areas where they were used to periods of hectic work, followed by periods of inactivity. Early factory workers therefore had to create a system of work discipline in which employees became used to working regular hours and doing the same work over and over. For example, adult workers were fined for being late and were dismissed for serious misconduct, especially for being drunk. Now we move on with the spread of industrialization. By the mid-19th century, Great Britain had become the world's first and richest industrial nation. It produced one half of the world's coal and manufactured goods. Its cotton industry alone in 1850 was equal in size to the industry of all the other European countries combined. In Europe, the Industrial Revolution spread to the rest of Europe at different times and speeds. First to be industrialized in continental Europe were Belgium, France, and German states. In this place, governments were very active in encouraging the development of industrialization. For example, governments provided funds to build roads, canals, and railroads. By 1850, a network of iron rails had spread across Europe. And then in North America, an industrial revolution also occurred in the nation of the United States. In 1800s, 6 out of 7 American workers were farmers and there were no cities with more than 100,000 people. Between 1800s and 1860, the population in the United States grew from about 5 million to 30 million people. And then Robert Fulton built the first paddle wheel steamboat, the Clermont, in 1807. By 1860, 1,000 steamboats plied to Mississippi River and made transportation easier on the Great Lakes and along the Atlantic coast, because most important in the development of American transportation system was the railroad. However, the Industrial Revolution drastically changed the social life of Europe and the world. This change was evident by 1850 in the growth of cities and the emergence of two new social classes, the industrial middle class and the industrial working class. In 1750, European population stood at estimated 140 million. By 1850, the population had almost doubled to 266 million. Population growth was so startling that in 1798, Thomas Malthus wrote a famous book arguing that the population would eventually outstrip humans' ability to feed themselves. Population grew because of a decline in death rates, wars, and disease such as smallpox and plague. People ate better and were more resistant to disease. Famine was almost unknown. The rapid growth of cities in the first half of the 19th century led to a pitiful living condition for many of the inhabitants. Eventually, this condition prompted urban reformers to call on local governments to clean up their cities. The calls for reform would be answered in the second half of the 19th century. In the Middle Ages had seen the rise of commercial capitalism, an economic system based on trade. With the Industrial Revolution came the rise of industrial capitalism, an economic system based on industrial production. Industrial capitalism produced a new middle-class group, the industrial middle class. In the Middle Ages, the bourgeois or middle-class person was the burgher or town dweller, who may have been active as a merchant, official, artisan, lawyer, or intellectual. Later, the term bourgeois came to include people involved in industry and banking, as well as professionals such as lawyers, teachers, doctors, and government officials. The new industrial middle class was made up of the people who built the factories, bought the machines, and figured out where the markets were. Also, the Industrial Revolution created an industrial working class. Industrial workers face wretched working conditions. Working hours range from 12 to 16 hours a day, 6 days a week, with a half hour for lunch and dinner. There was no security of employment and no minimum wage. Miles were also dirty, dusty, dangerous, and unhealthy. Conditions in the coal mines were also harsh. Dangerous conditions, including cave-ins, explosions, and gas fumes called bad air, were a way of life. Women and children made up two-thirds of the cotton industry workforce by 1830 in Great Britain. However, the number of children declined under the Factory Act of 1833, which set 9 as the minimum age for employment. Children 9 and 13 could work only 9 hours a day. Those between 13 and 18 could work 12 hours. As the number of children employed declined, their places were taken by women. Women made up 50% of the labor force in British textile factories before 1870. They were mostly unskilled labor and were paid half or less than half of what men received. Excessive working hours for women were outlawed in 1844. The law limits the working hours of children and women, thus gradually lead to a new pattern of work. Men were now expected to earn most of the family income by working outside the home. Women, in contrast, took over daily care of the family and performed low-paying jobs such as laundry work that could be done in the home. Working at home for pay made it possible for women to continue to help with the family's financial survival. In a nutshell, the Industrial Revolution created a great deal of change in society. One major change was the shift from work being done at home by hand in cottage industries to work being done in factories. There were harsh and unsafe working conditions in these early factories. Workers realized that they could pay women and children less than men. Child labor increased because it kept the cost of production low and the profits high. As a result of Industrial Revolution, the working class lived in poverty, while the bosses who made up the middle class grew wealthy. That's why in the first half of the 19th century, The pitiful conditions created by the Industrial Revolution gave rise to a movement known as socialism. Socialism is a system in which society, usually in the form of government, owns and controls means of production such as factories and utilities. Early socialism was largely the idea of intellectuals who believed in the equality of all people and who wanted to replace competition with cooperation in industry. Society as a whole therefore should own or at least control property for the benefits of all its members. To later socialists, especially the followers of Karl Marx, such ideas were merely impractical dreams. The later socialists contemptuously labeled the earlier theories utopian socialists. The term has lasted to this day. Robert Owen, a British cotton manufacturer, was one utopian socialist. He believed that humans would show their natural goodness if they live in a cooperative environment. After the defeat of Napoleon, European rulers moved to restore the old order. This was the goal of the great powers, Great Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia when they met at the Congress of Vienna in September 1814 to arrange a final peace settlement. The leader of the Congress was the Austrian Foreign Minister Prince Clemens von Metternich. Metternich claimed that he was guided at Vienna by the principle of legitimacy. This meant that lawful monarchs from the royal families that had ruled before Napoleon would be restored to their position of power in order to keep peace and stability in Europe. This had already been done in France with the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy. However, the principle of legitimacy was largely ignored elsewhere. Practical considerations of power were addressed at the Congress of Vienna. The great powers rearranged territories in Europe, believing that this would form a new balance of power. The powers of Vienna wanted to keep any one country from dominating Europe. This meant balancing political and military forces that guaranteed the independence of the great powers. The arrangements worked at the Congress of Vienna were a victory for rulers who wanted to contain the forces of change unleashed by the French Revolution. These rulers, like Metternich, believed in the political philosophy known as conservatism. Conservatism is based on a tradition and social stability. Most conservatives at the time favored obedience to political authority and believed that organized religion was crucial to order in society. Conservatism hated revolutions and were unwilling to accept demands from people who wanted either individual rights or representative governments. To maintain the new balance of power, Great Britain, Russia, Prussia, and Austria and later France agreed to meet at times in conference to take steps that would maintain the peace in Europe. These meetings came to be called the Concert of Europe. Eventually, the great powers adopted the principle of intervention. According to this principle, the great powers have the right to send armies into countries where there were revolutions in order to restore legitimate monarchs to their thrones. Britain refused to accept the principle, arguing that the great powers should not interfere in the internal affairs of other states. Austria, Prussia, Russia, and France, however, used military forces to crush revolutions in Spain and Italy, as well as to restore monarchs to their thrones. And then between 1815 and 1830, conservative governments throughout Europe worked to maintain the old order. However, powerful forces of change known as liberalism and nationalism were also at work. Liberalism is a political philosophy based largely on Enlightenment principles, held that people should be as free as possible from government restraint. Liberals had a common set of political beliefs. Chief among them was the protection of civil liberties or the basic rights of all people. These civil liberties included equality before the law and freedom of assembly, speech, and press. Liberals believed that all these freedoms should be guaranteed by a written document, such as the American Bill of Rights. Most liberals wanted religious toleration for all, as well as separation of church and state. Liberals also demanded the right of peaceful opposition to the government. They believed that laws should be made by a representative assembly elected by qualified voters. Many liberals then favored government ruled by a constitution, such as the constitutional monarchy, in which a king is regulated by a constitution. They believed that written constitution would guarantee the rights they sought to preserve. Liberals did not, however, believe in a democracy in which everyone had the right to vote. They thought that the right to vote and hold office should be open only to men of property. Liberalism then was tied to middle-class men, especially industrial middle-class men who wanted voting rights for themselves so they could share power with the land-owning classes. The liberals feared mob rule and had little desire to let the lower classes share that power. And then another powerful forces for change emerged to play an important role in world history, which was the nationalism. Nationalism was even more powerful force for change in the 19th century than liberalism. Nationalism arose out of people's awareness of being part of a community with common institutions, traditions, language, and customs. This community is called a nation. For nationalists, people owe their chief political loyalty to the nation rather than to a dynasty, city-state, or other political unit. Nationalism did not become a popular force for change until the French Revolution. From then on, nationalism came to believe that each nationality should have its own government. Nationalism then was a threat to the existing political order. A united Germany, for example, would upset the balance of power set up at the Congress of Vienna in 1815. Conservatives feared such change, thus tried hard to repress nationalism. In the first half of the 19th century, nationalism found a strong ally in liberalism. Most liberals believed that freedom could only be possible in people who ruled themselves. Each group of people should have its own state. No state should attempt to dominate another state. And then beginning in 1830, the forces of change, liberalism, and nationalism began to break through the conservative domination of Europe. In France, liberals overthrew the Bourbon monarch Charles X in 1830 and established a constitutional monarchy. Political support for the new monarch, Louis Philippe, a cousin of Charles X, came from the upper middle class. Nationalism was the chief force in three other revolutions the same year. Belgium, which had annexed to the former Dutch Republic in 1815, rebelled and created an independent state. Revolutions in Poland and Italy were less successful. Russian forces crushed the Poles, attempted to free themselves from foreign domination. Austrian troops marched into Italy and put down revolts in a number of Italian states. But despite the liberal and nationalist successes in France and Belgium, the conservative order still dominated much of Europe as the midpoint of the 19th century approached. However, the forces of liberalism and nationalism continued to grow. These forces of change erupted once more in the Revolution of 1848. Revolution in France was again the spark for revolution in other countries. Severe economic problems in 1846 brought untold hardship in France to the lower middle class, workers, and peasants, At the same time, members of the middle class clamored for right to vote. The government of Louis Philippe refused to make changes and opposition grew. The monarchy was finally overthrown in 1848. A group of moderate and radical Republicans set up a provisional or temporary government. The Republicans were people who wished France to be a republic, a government in which leaders are elected. The provisional government called for the election of representatives to a constituent assembly that would draw up a new constitution. Election was want to be by universal male suffrage, that is, all adult men could vote. And then the new constitution ratified on November 4, 1848, set up a republic called the Second Republic. The Second Republic had a single legislature elected by universal male suffrage. A president also chosen by universal male suffrage served for 4 years. In the election for the presidency held in December 1848, Charles Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, or called the Louis Napoleon, the nephew of the famous French ruler, won a resounding victory. The news of the 1848 revolution in France led to the upheaval in other parts of Europe. The Congress of Vienna in 1815 had recognized the existence of 38 independent German states called the German Confederation. Of these, Austria and Prussia were the two great powers. The other states varied in size. In 1848, cries for the change led many German rulers to promise constitutions, a free press, and jurial trial. Indeed, all German parliament called the Frankfurt Assembly was held to fulfill a liberal and nationalist dream. And then the Austrian Empire also had its problem. The empire was a multinational state, a collection of different peoples, including Germans, Czechs, Magyars or the Hungarians, Slovaks, Romanians, Slovenes, Poles, Croats, Serbians, and Italians. Only the Habsburg Emperor provided a common band. The Germans thought only a quarter of the population play a leading role in governing the Austrian Empire. That's why in March 1848, demonstrations in the major cities led to the dismissal of Metternich, the Austrian foreign minister. And then in Vienna, revolutionary forces took control of the capital and demanded a liberal constitution. To appease the revolutionaries, the government gave Hungary its own legislature. And then in Bohemia, the Czechs clamored for their own government. Austrian officials had made concessions to appease the revolutionaries, but were determined to re-establish their control over the empire. And then in June 1848, Austrian military forces crushed the Czech rebels in Prague. By the end of October, the rebels in Vienna had been defeated as well. With the help of a Russian army of 140,000 men, the Hungarian revolutionaries were finally subdued in 1849. The revolutions in the Austrian Empire had failed. Also, we have the revolts in the Italian states. The Congress of Vienna had set up 9 states in Italy, including the Kingdom of Piedmont in the north, the Kingdom of Two Sicilies, the Papal States, a handful of small states, and northern provinces of Lombardy and Venetia, which were now part of the Austrian Empire. In 1848, a revolt broke out against the Austrians in Lombardy and Venetia. Revolutionaries in the Italian states also took up arms and sought to create liberal constitution and unified Italy. By 1849, however, the Austrians had re-established complete control over Lombardy and Venetia. The old order also prevailed in the rest of Italy. As we can see, after the turmoil of the French Revolutionary years, European rulers wanted to return to a conservative order and to keep a balance of power among nations. Liberals and nationalists however, struggled to achieve more liberal governments and new nations. Their struggle led eventually to revolutions that swept across much of Europe in 1848. The revolutions of 1848 had failed. That's why in 1871, however, both Germany and Italy would be unified. The changes that made this possible began with the Crimean War. The Crimean War was the result of a long-standing struggle between Russia and the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire had long controlled much of the territory in the Balkans in southeastern Europe. By the beginning of the 19th century, however, the Ottoman Empire was in decline, and its authority over its territories in the Balkans began to weaken. Russia was especially interested in expanding its power into Ottoman lands in the Balkans. This expansion would give Russia access to the Dardanelles and the Mediterranean Sea. Russia would become the major power in Eastern Europe and could challenge British naval control of the Eastern Mediterranean. Other European powers feared Russian ambitions and had their own interest in the decline of the Ottoman Empire. That's why in 1853, the Russians invaded the Turkish Balkans provinces of Moldavia and Wallachia. In response, the Ottoman Turks declared war on Russia. Great Britain and France, fearful of Russian gains, declared war on Russia on the following year. This conflict came to be called the Crimean War. The Crimean War was poorly planned and poorly fought. Eventually, heavy losses caused the Russians to seek peace. By the Treaty of Paris, signed in March 1856, Russia agreed to allow Moldavia and Wallachia to be placed under the protection of all great powers. The effect of the Crimean War was to destroy the concert of Europe. Austria and Russia had been the two chief powers maintaining the status quo in the first half of the 19th century. They were now enemies because Austria, which had its own interest in the Balkans, had refused to support Russia in the Crimean War. A defeated and humiliated Russia withdrew from European affairs for the next 20 years. Austria was now without friends among the great powers. This new international situation opened the door for the unification of both Italy and Germany. In 1850, Austria was still the dominant power of the Italian peninsula. After the failure of the Revolution of 1848, people began to look to the northern Italian state of Piedmont for leadership in achieving the unification of Italy. The royal house of Savoy ruled the kingdom of Piedmont, which included the island of Sardinia, Nice, and Savoy. The ruler of the kingdom beginning in 1849 was King Victor Emmanuel II. The king named Camillo de Cavour his prime minister in 1852. Cavour was a dedicated political leader. As a prime minister, he pursued a policy of economic expansion that increased government revenues and enabled the kingdom to equip a large army. Cavour, however, knew that Piedmont's army was not strong enough to defeat the Austrians. He would need help, so he made an alliance with the French Emperor Louis Napoleon, and then he provoked the Austrians into invading the Piedmont in 1859. The final result of the conflict that followed was the peace settlement that gave French Nice and Savoy. Cavour had promised Nice and Savoy to the French for making the alliance. Lombardy, which had been under Austrian control, was given to the Piedmont, while Austria retained control of Venetia. Cavour's success caused nationalists in some other northern Italian states to overthrow their governments and join their states to Piedmont. Meanwhile, in southern Italy, a new leader of Italian unification had arisen. Giuseppe Garibaldi, a dedicated Italian patriot, raised an army of 1,000 volunteers called red shirts because of the color of their uniforms. The Kingdom of Two Sicilies was ruled by a branch of the Bourbon dynasty, and a revolt had broken out in Sicily against the king. Garibaldi's forces landed in Sicily, and by the end of July 1860 controlled most of the island. In August, Garibaldi and his forces crossed over to the mainland and began a victorious march up the Italian peninsula. Naples and the entire Kingdom of the Two Sicilies fell in early September. Garibaldi chose to turn over his conquest to Piedmont. And then on March 17, 1861, a new Kingdom of Italy was proclaimed under the King Victor Emmanuel II. The task of unification was not yet complete. Venetia in the north was still held by Austria, and Rome was under the control of the Pope, supported by French troops. The Italians gained control of Venetia as a result of a war between Austria and Prussia. In the Austro-Prussian War of 1866, the new Italian states became an ally of Prussia. Prussia won the war, and the Italians were given Venetia. In 1870, during the Franco-Prussian War, French troops withdrew from Rome. Their withdrawal enabled the Italian army to annex Rome on September 20, 1870. Rome became the capital of the United Italian State. After the failure of the Frankfurt Assembly to achieve German unification in 1848 and 1849, Germans looked to Prussia for leadership in the cause of German unification. In the course of the 19th century, Prussia had become a strong and prosperous state. Its government was authoritarian. The Prussian king had firm control over both the government and the army. Prussia was also known for its militarism, or reliance on military strength. In the 1860s, King William I tried to enlarge the Prussian army. When the Prussian legislature refused to levy new taxes for the proposed military changes, William I appointed a new prime minister, Count Otto von Bismarck. Bismarck has often been seen as the foremost 19th century practitioner of real politica, or the politics of reality, or politics based on practical matters rather than on theory or ethics. Bismarck was open about his strong dislike of anyone who opposed him. After his appointment, Bismarck ignored the legislative opposition to the military reforms. He argued instead that Germany does not look to Prussia's liberalism but to her power. After defeating Denmark with Austrian help in 1864 and gaining control of the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein, Bismarck created friction with the Austrians and forced them into war on June 14, 1866. The Austrians no match for the well-disciplined Prussian army. That's why they were decisively defeated on July 3. Prussia now organized the German states north of the Main River into a North German Confederation. The southern German states, which were largely Catholic, feared Protestant Prussia. However, they also feared France, their western neighbor. As a result, they agreed to sign military alliances with Prussia for protection against France. Prussia now dominated all of the northern Germany, but problems with France soon arose. Bismarck realized that France would never be content with a strong German state to its east because of the potential threat to French security. That's why in 1870, Prussia and France became embroiled in the dispute over the candidacy of a relative of the Prussian king for the throne of Spain. Bismarck took advantage of the misunderstandings between the French and Prussians to goad the French into declaring war on Prussia on July 19, 1870. This conflict was called the Franco-Prussian War. The French proved to be no match for the better-led and better-organized Prussian forces. The southern German states honored their military alliances with Prussia, and joined the war effort against the French. Prussian armies advanced in France at Sedan on September 2, 1870. An entire French army and French ruler Napoleon III were captured. Paris finally surrendered on January 28, 1871. An official peace treaty was signed in May. France had to pay 5 billion francs or about 1 billion US dollars and give up the provinces of Alsace and Lorraine to the new German states. The loss of these territories left the French burning for revenge. Even before the war had ended, the southern German states had agreed to enter the North German Confederation. On January 18, 1871, Bismarck and 600 German princes, nobles, and generals filled the Hall of Mirrors in the Palace of Versailles, 12 miles outside Paris. And then William I of Prussia was proclaimed Kaiser or Emperor of the Second German Empire. The first was the medieval Holy Roman Empire. German unity had been achieved by the Prussian monarchy and the Prussian army. The authoritarian and militaristic values of Prussia were triumphant in the new German state. With its industrial resources and military might, the new state had become the strongest power on the European continent. While Italy and Germany were being unified, other states in Europe were also experiencing changes. In Great Britain, they managed to avoid the revolutionary upheavals of the first half of the 19th century. In 1815, Great Britain was governed by aristocratic land-owning classes which dominated both houses of Parliament. In 1832, Parliament passed a bill that increased the number of male voters. The new voters were chiefly members of the industrial middle class. In the 1850s and 1860s, Parliament continued to make both social and political reforms that helped the country to remain stable. Another reason for Britain's stability was its continuing economic growth. The British feeling of national pride was well reflected in Queen Victoria, whose reign from 1837 to 1901 was the longest in English history. Her sense of duty and moral responsibility reflected the attitudes of her age, which has ever since been known as the Victorian Age. In France, events after the Revolution of 1848 moved toward the restoration of the monarchy. 4 years after his election as president in 1848, Louis Napoleon returned to the people to ask for the restoration of the empire. In this plebiscite or popular vote, 97% responded with a yes vote. That's why on December 2, 1852, Louis Napoleon assumed the title of Napoleon III, Emperor of France. The Second Empire had begun. The government of Napoleon III was clearly authoritarian. Only he could introduce legislation and declare war. Napoleon III completely controlled the government and limited civil liberties. In the midst of this economic expansion, Napoleon III also carried out a vast rebuilding of the city of Paris. The old Paris of narrow streets and walls was replaced by a modern Paris of broad boulevards, spacious buildings, public squares, and underground sewage system, a new public water supply system, and gas lights. However, after the French were defeated in the Prussian War in 1870, the Second Empire fell. As we have seen, nationalism was a major force in the 19th century Europe. However, one of the Europe's most powerful states, the Austrian Empire, was a multinational empire that had been able to frustrate the desire of its ethnic groups for independence. After the Habsburg rulers crushed the revolutions of 1848 and 1849, they restored centralized and autocratic government to the empire. Austria's defeat at the hands of the Prussians in 1866, however, forced the Austrians to make concessions to the fiercely nationalistic Hungarians. The result was the Compromise of 1867. This compromise created the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary. The compromise, of course, did not satisfy the other nationalities that made up the multinational Austro-Hungarian Empire. And then in Russia, at the beginning of the 19th century, Russia was overwhelmingly rural, agricultural, and autocratic. The Russian Czar was still regarded as the divine right monarchy with unlimited power. The Russian government, based on soldiers, secret police, repression, and censorship, withstood the revolutionary fervor of the first half of the 19th century. In 1856, however, as described earlier, the Russians suffered a humiliating defeat in the Crimean War. Even such conservatives now realized that Russia was falling hopelessly behind the Western European powers. And then Caesar Alexander II decided to make serious reforms. Serfdom was the largest problem in Czarist Russia. On March 3, 1861, Alexander issued an emancipation edict which freed the serfs. Peasants could now own property and marry as they chose. And then Alexander II attempted another reform as well, but he soon found that he could please no one. Reformers wanted more changes and a faster pace for change. Conservatives thought that Caesar was trying to destroy the basic institution of Russian society. When a group of radicals assassinated Alexander II in 1881, his son and successor Alexander III turned against reform and returned the old methods of repression. Now let's move on with the nationalism in the United States. The government under the U.S. Constitution had committed the United States to two of the major forces of the first half of the 19th century, the liberalism and nationalism. National unity had not come easily. However, two factions had fought bitterly about the division of power in the new government. The Federalists had favored a strong central government, while the Republicans, fearing central power, they wanted the federal government to be subordinate to the state government. By the mid-19th century, slavery had become a threat to American national unity. There were 4 million African American slaves in the South by 1860, compared with 1 million in 1800. The South's economy was based on growing cotton plantations, chiefly by slave labor. At the same time, abolitionism, or a movement to end slavery, arose in the North and challenged the Southern way of life. As opinion over slavery grew more divided, compromise became less possible. Abraham Lincoln said in his speech in Illinois in 1858 that this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. That's why when Lincoln was elected president in November 1860, the die was cast. On December 20, 1860, a South Carolina convention voted to secede or withdraw from the United States. In February 1861, 6 more southern states did the same, and a rival nation, the Confederate States of America, was formed. In April, fighting erupted between the North and South, the Union and the Confederacy. The American Civil War, which started 1861 to 1865, was an extraordinary bloody struggle. Over 600,000 soldiers died, either in battle or from deadly disease spawned by filthy camp conditions. The Union, with more men and resources, gradually wore the Confederacy. That's why on January 1, 1863, Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation declared most of the nation's slaves forever free. The surrender of Confederate forces on April 1865 meant that the United States would be one nation, indivisible. National unity had prevailed in the United States. Finally, the emergence of a Canadian nation. By the Treaty of Paris in 1763, signed at the end of the 7 Years' War, Canada was passed from the French to the British. By 1800, most of the Canadian people favor more freedom from British rule. However, there were also serious differences among the colonies. Upper Canada, which is now Ontario, was mostly English-speaking, whereas Lower Canada, now Quebec, was mostly French-speaking. After two short rebellions against the government broke out in Upper and Lower Canada in 1837 and 1838, the British moved toward change. In 1840, the British Parliament formally joined Upper and Lower Canada into the United Provinces of Canada. The United Provinces was not self-governed. The head of the Upper Canada's Conservative Party was John Macdonald, become a strong voice for self-government. The British, fearful of American designs on Canada, finally gave in. That's why in 1867, Parliament passed the British North America Act, which established a Canadian nation, the domination of Canada, with its own constitution. John Macdonald became the first Prime Minister of the domination. Canada now possessed a parliamentary system and ruled itself, although foreign affairs remained in the hands of the British government. At the end of the 18th century, a new intellectual movement known as Romanticism emerged as a reaction to the ideas of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment had stressed reason as the chief means for discovering truth. The Romantics emphasized feelings, emotion, and imagination as source of knowing. The Romantics believed that emotion and sentiment were only understandable to the person experiencing them. In their novels, Romantic writers created figures who were often misunderstood and rejected by society, but who continued to believe in their own worth through their inner feelings. Romantics also valued individualism, the belief in the uniqueness of each person. Many Romantics rebelled against middle-class conventions. Many Romantics grew long hair and beards, and both men and women wore outrageous clothes to express their individuality. Many Romantics had a passionate interest in the past. They revived medieval architecture and built castles, cathedrals, city halls, and parliamentary buildings, and even railway stations in a style called Neo-Gothic. Literature too reflected this interest in the past. The novels of Walter Scott became bestsellers in the first half of the 19th century. Ivanhoe, in which Scott tried to evoke clashes between knights in medieval England, became his most popular novel. By focusing on their nation's past, many Romantic writers created literature that reflected the 19th century's fascination with nationalism. The exotic and unfamiliar also attracted many Romantics. This attraction gave rise to Gothic literature. Chilling examples are Mary Shelley's Frankenstein in Britain and Edgar Allan Poe's short stories of horror in the United States. Some Romantics even sought the unusual in their own lives by exploring their dreams and nightmares and seeking altered states of consciousness. The Romantics viewed poetry as the direct expression of the soul. Romantic poetry gave expression to one of the most important characteristics of Romanticism, its love of nature. Romantics believed that nature served as a mirror into which humans could look to learn about themselves. This is especially evident in the poetry of William Wordsworth, the foremost English Romantic poet of nature. Like the literary arts, the visual arts were deeply affected by Romanticism. Romantic artists shared at least two features. First, to them, all arts was a reflection of the artist's inner feelings. A painting should mirror the artist's vision of the world and be the instrument of the artist's own imagination. Second, Romantic artists abandoned classical reason for warmth and emotion. Like his contemporary William Wordsworth, English artist John Constable sought to capture nature's dramatic beauty in his works. Constable's watercolor of Stonehenge from 1835 reflects the romantic emphasis on emotion over reason. And then Eugene Delacroix was one of the most famous romantic painters from France. His paintings showed two chief characteristics: a fascination with the exotic and a passion for color. His works reflects his belief that a painting should be a feast to the eye. Also, to many romantics, music was the most romantic of the arts because it enables the composer to probe deeply into human emotions. Music historians have called the 19th century the age of Romanticism. One of the greatest composers of all time, Ludwig van Beethoven, was the bridge between the classical and romantic periods in music. Beethoven was one of the few composers who was able single-handedly to transform the art of music. For Beethoven, music had to reflect his deepest inner feelings. I must write, for what waits on my heart, I must express. That's why Beethoven's early work fell largely within the classical framework of the 18th century. Now, let's move on with the new age of science. The scientific revolution had created a modern and rational approach to the study of the natural world. For a long time, only the educated elite understood its importance. By the 1830s, however, new discoveries in science had led to many practical benefits that affected all Europeans. That's why in 1796, for example, Edward Jenner had discovered a vaccine for smallpox, a widespread disease that killed mostly infants and young children. In biology, the Frenchman Louis Pasteur proposed the germ theory of disease, which was crucial to the development of modern scientific medical practices. And in chemistry, the Russian Dmitry Mendeleev in the 1860s classified all the material elements then known on the basis of their atomic weights. In Great Britain, Michael Faraday put together a primitive generator that laid the foundation for the use of electric current. The dramatic material benefits often provided by science and technology led Europeans to have a growing faith in science. It is no accident that the 19th century was an age of increasing secularization. For many people, truth was now to be found in science and the concrete material existence of humans. In 1859, Charles Darwin published on the origins of species by means of natural selection. The basic idea of this book was that each kind of plant and animal had evolved over a long period of time from earlier and simpler form of life. Darwin called this principle organic evolution. How did this natural process work? According to Darwin, in every species, many more individuals of each species are born than can possibly survive. This results in a struggle for existence. Darwin believed that some organisms are more adaptable to the environment than others, a process that Darwin called the natural selection. Those that are naturally selected for survival reproduce and thrive. The unfit do not survive. The fit to survive pass on the variations that enable them to survive until, according to Darwin, a new separate species emerged. And then in the Descent of Man, published in 1871, Darwin argued that human beings had animal origins and were not an exemption to the rule governing other species. Darwin's ideas raised a storm of controversy. Some people objected that Darwin's theory made human beings ordinary products of nature rather than unique beings. Others were bothered by his idea of life as a mere struggle for survival. Is there a place in the Darwinian world for moral values, they asked. Many people also condemned Darwin for denying God's role in creation. Gradually, many scientists and other intellectuals came to accept Darwin's theory. Now let me explain how realism reflected changes in society in Europe and North America. Realism is a belief that the world should be viewed realistically. A view frequently expressed after 1850 was closely related to the scientific outlook. In politics, Bismarck had practiced the politics of reality, and then realism became a movement in the literary and visual arts as well. The literary realists of the mid-19th century rejected Romanticism. They wanted to write about ordinary characters from actual life rather than romantic heroes in exotic settings. They also tried to avoid emotional language by using precise description. They preferred novels to poems, and then many literary realists combined their interest in everyday life with an examination of social issues. These artists expressed their social views through their characters. Although this type of realistic writing occurred worldwide, the French led the way. And then the realist novel was perfected by the French author Gustave Flaubert, who was a leading novelist of the 1850s and 1860s. His work Madame Bovary presents a critical description of small-town life in France. And then the British novelist Charles Dickens became very successful with his realistic novels, focusing on the lower and middle classes in Britain's early industrial age. In such novels as Oliver Twist and David Copperfield, Dickens described the urban poor and the brutal life they led with vivid realism. Gustave Courbet was the most famous artist of the realist school. He loved to portray scenes from everyday life. His subjects were factory workers, peasants, and wives of salon keepers. One of his famous works, The Stone Breakers, shows two road workers engaged in the deadening work of breaking stones to build a road. There were those who objected to Courbet's cult of ugliness and who found such scenes of human misery scandalous. To Courbet, however, no subject was too ordinary, too harsh, or too ugly. As we can see, realism and romanticism vary in terms of visual goals and political agenda. The distinctions between the movements denote that their inspiration evolved from artistic style of the past, but were responsive to the changing political climate. Romanticism concerns itself with ideals. Realism concerns itself with more concrete, factual, and everyday matters. Romanticism idealizes nature, while realism attempts to address the often harsh facts of nature in a matter-of-fact fashion. The two schools shared nearly nothing as common ground. The language of realism often guttural, while the language of romanticism is fluid and lovely.